In a time when a woman's worth was measured by her daintiness, Josephine Rutledge stood 6'1". Mocked, ostracized, and publicly shattered by the town's wealthiest bachelor, she thought her chance at love was sealed. But out in the unforgiven dust of Wyoming, a real man doesn't fear a long shadow. The year was 1888, and the Wyoming Territory was no place for the fragile. Yet, ironically, fragility was exactly what society demanded of its women. A woman was meant to be a delicate flower, a soft-spoken companion who looked up to her husband, literally and figuratively. Josephine Rutledge, however, was no delicate flower. By her 19th birthday, she stood a breathtaking 6 feet and 1 inch tall, towering over not just the other women of Oak Haven, but more than half the men. To say Josie's height was a source of whispered gossip would be a gross understatement. It was the town's favorite spectacle. When she walked down the wooden boardwalks to fetch flour from Gable's Mercantile, conversations would abruptly halt. Mothers would pull their daughters closer, and the rough-hewn ranch hands leaning against the saloon rails would nudge each other, snickering into their whiskey glasses. "There goes the Oak Haven giantess," they'd mutter. Josie bore it all with a rigid spine and eyes fixed firmly on the horizon. But beneath her stoic exterior, her heart was a bruised, battered thing. She had been orphaned at 14 and taken in by her Aunt Martha, a pragmatic, hard-bitten woman who saw Josie's height not as a physical trait, but as a catastrophic liability. "You've got to shrink yourself, Josephine," Aunt Martha would hiss, pinning the hem of Josie's skirts. "Slouch a little. Keep your head down. How do you expect me to marry you off when you look like you could wrestle a steer to the ground?" Despite the odds, Aunt Martha had managed to secure a courtship for Josie with Bartholomew Higgins. Bart was the sole heir to the Higgins Livestock and Trust, the wealthiest family within 100 miles. He was a handsome man with slicked-back blonde hair and a smile that rarely reached his cold, calculating eyes. He stood at 5'9". Bart didn't love Josie. He was courting her because his father, old man Samuel Higgins, wanted the prime, water-rich acreage that Aunt Martha sat on, and a marriage was cheaper than a land purchase. For 6 months, Josie tried desperately to be the woman Bart wanted. She wore flat-soled slippers that offered no support against the hard Wyoming ground. She slouched until her shoulders ached, her posture permanently curved in a desperate bid to appear smaller. She spoke in hushed, breathy tones, stifling her naturally robust laugh. She thought, in her naive desperation for acceptance, that it was working. She thought Bart was growing fond of her. Then came the Oak Haven Autumn Jubilee. It was the biggest social event of the year, held in the newly constructed community barn. Josie had spent 3 weeks sewing a dress of pale lilac cotton, adding extra ruffles at the hem to distract from the sheer length of the skirt. When she arrived on Bart's arm, the barn was alight with lanterns and alive with the frantic scraping of fiddles. For the first hour, things were tolerable, but as the whiskey flowed, Bart's mood soured. He hated the stares they drew. He hated that, when they stood together, the top of his expensive Stetson barely brushed her chin. His fragile ego, inflated by wealth but punctured by the mocking grins of his peers, began to fracture. The breaking point happened during a reel. Bart had abandoned Josie by the punch bowl to dance with Clara Jenkins, a petite, 5'0" blonde who giggled at everything he said. When the song ended, Bart's friends, fueled by cheap bourbon, began goading him. "Say, Bart," yelled a rancher named Jebediah, his voice cutting through the noise. "When you kiss your bride, do you plan on standing on a soapbox, or are you going to make her kneel in the dirt?" The barn erupted in cruel, raucous laughter. Josie froze, the tin cup of cider trembling in her large, capable hands. She looked at Bart, expecting him to defend her, to brush off the insult. Instead, Bart's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He looked at the laughing crowd, then looked at Josie, his eyes filled with sudden, undeniable disgust. "I ain't marrying her," Bart slurred loudly, his voice echoing off the rafters. The fiddles died down to a screeching halt. The silence that followed was deafening. Bart took a step away from Clara and pointed a finger at Josie. "You think I want a freak for a wife? A woman who looks down the bridge of her nose at me? My father can buy that miserable piece of land without me having to shackle myself to a lumberjack." The words struck Josie with the physical force of a bullet. The blood drained from her face. She saw Aunt Martha in the corner, her face buried in her hands in utter shame. She saw the pity in the eyes of the older women and the cruel amusement in the eyes of the men. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. With a dignity that cost her every ounce of her remaining willpower, Josie set the tin cup down on the table, picked up the skirts of her handmade lilac dress, and walked out of the barn. Only when the heavy wooden doors swung shut behind her, plunging her into the cold, star-lit Wyoming night, did the first sob tear from her throat. She ran. She ran until her flat-soled slippers tore against the gravel, heading blindly toward the dark silhouette of the town's livery stable, seeking the only thing she craved in the world, a place where no one could see her. The livery stable smelled of sweet hay, leather, and manure, a comforting, grounded scent. Josie collapsed behind a stack of oat barrels, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as physically possible. The tears came in violent, shuddering waves. She wept for the humiliation, for her aunt's dashed hopes, but mostly she wept for the absolute certainty that she was unlovable. She was a defect, a monstrous anomaly in a world built for the delicate. "If you keep crying like that, you're gonna spook Brimstone, and he's ornery enough as it is." The voice came from the shadows, deep, gravelly, and startlingly calm. Josie gasped, scrambling backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She hurriedly wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, her cheeks burning with fresh humiliation. I apologize," she stammered, trying to stand up, but hitting her head on a low crossbeam. She winced, sinking back down. "I thought it was empty." A lantern flared to life, casting a warm, golden glow over the dusty air. Holding it was a man she recognized, though they had never spoken. Samuel Caldwell. Samuel was a lone wolf in Oak Haven. He ran a struggling cattle operation on the rocky eastern ridge, a piece of land he'd inherited from a father who left him nothing but debts and a stubborn streak. Samuel was a quiet man, known for his relentless work ethic and his solitary nature. Standing at 6'3", with broad shoulders honed by brutal manual labor, he was one of the few men in town who didn't have to tilt his head back to look Josie in the eye. His face was weathered, framed by dark, unruly hair, and his eyes were a piercing, observant gray. He didn't look at her with pity, nor with the mocking amusement she was so accustomed to. He just looked at her. "Brimstone's my roan gelding," Samuel said casually, hanging the lantern on a nail. He picked up a brush and turned back to the massive horse occupying the nearest stall. "He prefers silence, or at least a quieter kind of sorrow." Josie swallowed hard, wrapping her arms around her waist. "I'll leave." "Didn't say you had to leave," Samuel replied, his rhythmic brushing of the horse's coat filling the quiet space. Just said you were loud. Sit still. The dust out there's too thick for a lady right now anyway." A lady. The word caught in Josie's throat. Bart had just effectively told the entire town she was a freak of nature, a lumberjack. "I heard what happened in the barn," Samuel said quietly, not looking at her, keeping his focus on the horse. Josie closed her eyes, fresh tears threatening to spill. "Then you know why I'm hiding. Please, Mr. Caldwell, don't mock me. I don't think I can bear it tonight." Samuel stopped brushing. He turned slowly, leaning his forearms against the top rail of the stall. He studied her for a long moment. "Why would I mock you, Miss Rutledge? Because a coward with more money than sense couldn't handle the fact that you cast a taller shadow than he does." Josie blinked, startled by the bluntness of his words. "Bart Higgins," Samuel continued, his voice laced with quiet contempt, "is a small man. And I don't mean his height. He needs people beneath him to feel like he's standing on top of a mountain. You—" Samuel's eyes drifted over her, noting the way she was hunched over, trying to hide her long limbs. "You make him feel small just by existing. That ain't your failing, Josephine. It's his." No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever suggested that her height wasn't a curse to be apologized for. "My aunt says no man will ever want a woman he has to look up to," Josie whispered, the dark confession slipping out before she could stop it. Samuel walked over to the oat barrels, his boots thudding softly against the packed dirt floor. He stopped a few feet from her. "Your aunt is wrong. A weak man wants a woman he can look down on. A real man wants a partner who can look him dead in the eye when the storm hits." He reached out his hand. It was a large hand, calloused and scarred from years of fencing and roping. "They're playing a waltz in there," Samuel said, tipping his head toward the distant sound of the fiddles bleeding through the night air. "I don't much care for crowded rooms, and I don't much care for the people in them tonight, but I wouldn't mind a dance." Josie stared at his outstretched hand. "Here? In the dirt?" "Dirt's honest," Samuel said, a ghost of a smile touching the corners of his mouth. "More honest than those floorboards in there." Trembling, Josie unclasped her arms from her knees. She reached out, her long, elegant fingers resting in his rough palm. He gently pulled her to her feet. As she stood to her full height, habit took over. She immediately slumped her shoulders, dropping her chin. Samuel stepped closer. He placed 2 fingers under her chin and gently but firmly lifted her head. "Stand up, Josephine. God gave you that height. Stop apologizing for it." She straightened her spine. For the first time in her adult life, she stood at her full 6'1" in front of a man, and she wasn't met with a scowl or a sneer. She was met with a gaze of genuine admiration. They danced in the dim lantern light of the livery stable, the scent of hay around them, their boots shuffling in the Wyoming dust. Samuel held her securely, his hand warm against her back. He didn't struggle to guide her. They moved with a natural, unforced rhythm. For the first time, Josie didn't feel like a giant. She just felt like a woman. But out in the unforgiven West, a moment of peace rarely lasts. The next morning, the town of Oak Haven was ablaze with rumors, not just about Bart Higgins rejecting the giantess, but about the fact that Samuel Caldwell had been seen walking her back to her aunt's property in the dead of night. When Bart heard the news over his morning coffee at the hotel dining room, his humiliation turned venomous. It wasn't that he wanted Josie. He had made that abundantly clear. But his pride could not fathom that the woman he had publicly discarded as unlovable had immediately found solace, and with Samuel Caldwell of all people. Samuel was a thorn in the Higgins family's side. The Caldwell Ranch bordered a vital river access point that Old Man Higgins desperately needed for his expanding cattle empire. The Higgins Bank held the mortgage on Samuel's land, a debt Samuel had been painstakingly paying off, penny by penny. Bart slammed his coffee cup down, spilling the dark liquid across the pristine white tablecloth. He wiped his mouth, a cruel, calculating sneer forming on his lips. "If Caldwell wants my leftovers," Bart muttered to his associate sitting at the table, "he can have her. But he's not keeping that land. Call in his loans. All of them. Today." The twist of fate was set into motion. Josie thought her greatest battle was overcoming the judgment of society. But as she sat on her aunt's porch that morning, thinking of the rugged cowboy who had asked her to dance in the dirt, she had no idea that her newfound connection was about to plunge them both into a bitter, high-stakes war for survival. The Wyoming wind carried the news faster than a telegraph wire. By Tuesday, a stark white notice of foreclosure was nailed to the heavy oak doors of the Higgins Livestock and Trust. Samuel Caldwell had exactly 7 days to produce $3,400, a staggering sum that might as well have been $1 million. When Josie saw the notice, her stomach plummeted into her boots. She stood on the boardwalk, the harsh morning sun casting her long shadow across the dusty street, and felt a sickening wave of guilt. She knew Bart. She knew his petty, fragile pride. This wasn't about business. This was a calculated execution. Bart was punishing Samuel for treating her like a human being, and he was punishing her by destroying the one man who had shown her kindness. She hurried back to Aunt Martha's clapboard house, her mind racing. She found her aunt in the parlor, frantically packing a small valise. "What are you doing?" Josie asked, her voice tight. Aunt Martha didn't look up, her hands trembling as she folded a shawl. "We are leaving, Josephine. Bart Higgins sent a messenger this morning. He's withdrawn his offer on our land. He says if he can't have a compliant wife, he'll just wait until the bank starves us out and take the land for pennies. You've ruined us. With your defiance, your sheer size. I told you to apologize to him." "Apologize for what?" Josie's voice rose, vibrating with a newfound resonance. "For breathing? For standing on my own 2 feet? I won't beg a tyrant for scraps, Aunt Martha." "Then you will starve," Martha shrieked, finally looking up, her eyes wide with terror and resentment. "You go to that bank right now, get on your knees, and you beg Bartholomew Higgins for forgiveness, or you're no longer welcome in this house." The ultimatum hung in the stuffy parlor air, heavy and suffocating. A week ago, Josie would have crumbled. She would have slouched her shoulders, wept, and marched to the bank to sacrifice her dignity for her aunt's security. But she remembered the smell of sweet hay in the livery. She remembered the rough, warm weight of Samuel's hand on her back and the way he had tipped her chin up. "Stand up, Josephine." Josie drew a deep breath, her spine straightening until her head nearly brushed the hanging chandelier. "I wish you well, Aunt Martha," Josie said quietly, her voice steady. "But my knees belong to me, and they won't bend for Bart Higgins." She packed nothing but a heavy canvas coat, a sturdy pair of men's riding boots she'd secretly bought years ago, and a canteen. Within the hour, she was walking the 5 miles out to the eastern ridge. She found Samuel in the main corral, his face grim, covered in dust and sweat as he sorted his prime longhorns. Beside him was his sole ranch hand, a grizzled old cowboy named Clem, who looked as defeated as the dry earth beneath them. "You shouldn't be here, Josie," Samuel said without looking up from the gate latch. Higgins' men are watching the property lines. They see you here, it'll only make it worse for you." "It can't get worse," Josie said, stepping up to the wooden fence. "My aunt threw me out. Bart rescinded the offer on her land. We are both in the vulture's crosshairs now, Samuel." Samuel finally stopped, wiping his brow with the back of a leather-gloved hand. His gray eyes softened as he looked at her, taking in her practical men's boots and the canvas coat. "I'm sorry, Josie. I dragged you into my mess." "No, I dragged you into mine," she countered fiercely. "What are you doing with the herd?" "Selling them to the local slaughterhouse," Clem muttered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Taking a beating on the price. Pennies on the dollar. Might raise $500 if we're lucky. Ain't nearly enough to save the spread." Josie looked at the cattle, 300 head of prime, heavy beef. "What if you took them to the railhead in Cheyenne? The beef buyers there are paying premium prices for eastern markets. I read it in the Denver Post last week. They'd fetch 3 times what the locals will pay. It would cover the debt." Samuel shook his head. "Cheyenne is a 4-day drive through the Devil's Anvil Pass. I've only got Clem. You can't drive 300 ornery steers through that kind of rock and river with just 2 men. We'd lose half the herd in the canyons." "You don't have 2 men," Josie said, her voice ringing out clear and loud over the lowing of the cattle. She unlatched the corral gate and stepped inside the pen. A massive 1,000-pound steer tossed its head, horns swinging dangerously close to her ribs. Josie didn't flinch. She stepped into the animal's path, raised her arms, and let out a sharp, commanding whistle, slapping her thigh. The steer blinked, intimidated by the sheer height and unyielding presence of the human before it, and docilely turned back into the herd. Samuel and Clem stared at her. "You have 3, Josie said, turning back to Samuel, her eyes blazing with absolute defiance. "I can ride. I can rope well enough. And as Bart Higgins so kindly pointed out to the entire town, I'm built like a lumberjack. Put me to work, Samuel." A slow, genuine smile spread across Samuel's weathered face. He looked at Clem, who simply shrugged and chuckled, tipping his hat to the tall woman in the dirt. "Saddle up, Josephine," Samuel said. "We leave in an hour." The drive through the Devil's Anvil was a descent into purgatory. The landscape was a brutal, jagged scar of red rock, treacherous switchbacks, and unpredictable weather. For 3 days, they lived on black coffee, hardtack, and adrenaline. Josie proved her worth 10 times over. When a wagon wheel snapped on the chuck cart, it was Josie who wedged her shoulder under the heavy wooden axle, her long, powerful legs driving into the mud, holding the immense weight while Samuel swapped the wheel. When the herd spooked during a midnight thunderstorm, it was Josie's booming voice and fearless riding that turned the lead steers back from the edge of a sheer cliff. She was exhausted, bruised, and covered in a thick layer of trail dust. But as she sat by the campfire on the 3rd night, her muscles aching with the satisfying fire, she felt an overwhelming sense of liberation. She wasn't a freak here. She was a necessity. "You kept the herd from fracturing today," Samuel said, walking over and handing her a tin cup of steaming coffee. He sat on a rock beside her, the firelight dancing in his eyes. "They're good animals," Josie said softly, wrapping her large hands around the warm tin. "They just needed a firm boundary." Samuel looked at her, his gaze lingering on the dirt smudged across her cheek, the wild tangle of her hair, and the proud straight line of her spine. "I wasn't talking about the cattle, Josie." He reached out, his rough thumb gently brushing the dirt from her cheekbone. "I've never met a woman like you. I've never met a person like you." Josie's breath hitched. In the quiet solitude of the canyon, stripped of societal expectations and cruel judgments, the connection between them solidified into something unbreakable, forged in dust, sweat, and mutual respect. They reached the Cheyenne railhead the next afternoon. The beef buyers, desperate for high-quality stock to fill the eastbound trains, took one look at Samuel's well-fed herd and engaged in a bidding war. When Samuel walked out of the assayer's office, he held a bank draft for $4,000. They had done it. The morning of the foreclosure dawned crisp and cold in Oak Haven. At precisely 8 o'clock, Bart Higgins, flanked by his father, Samuel Higgins, the local sheriff, and 2 armed deputies, rode onto the Caldwell Ranch. Bart wore a smug, victorious grin. He dismounted, pulling the foreclosure deed from his pristine wool coat, ready to nail it to the front door of the modest ranch house. "Look alive, boys," Bart crowed to the deputies. "I want the locks changed and the livestock inventoried by noon." "You're a bit early for inventory, Higgins," a deep, booming voice echoed across the yard. Bart spun around. Riding down the eastern ridge crest were Samuel, Clem, and Josie. They looked like they had ridden through hell and back, covered in trail dust and exhaustion, but they sat tall in their saddles. Bart's smirk faltered as they approached, but he quickly recovered his sneer. "Well, if it isn't the romantic fools. Where have you been, Caldwell? Taken the giantess on a scenic tour before I take your home?" Samuel reined in his horse, his face an impenetrable mask of calm. He didn't say a word. Instead, he looked at Josie and nodded. Josie swung her leg over her saddle and dropped to the ground. Her boots hit the dirt with a heavy, authoritative thud. She didn't slouch. She didn't drop her gaze. She pulled her shoulders back, stood to her full 6'1" height, and walked methodically toward Bart Higgins. Bart, standing at 5'9", instinctively took a step back as her shadow fell over him. For the first time, he looked genuinely intimidated. "You called me a freak, Bart," Josie said, her voice ringing with crystalline clarity in the quiet morning air. The sheriff and the deputies watched in stunned silence. "You tried to break me because my existence made you feel small. And then you tried to break a good man just because he wasn't afraid of me." She reached into her heavy canvas coat and pulled out the thick stack of banknotes they had converted in Cheyenne. She didn't hand them to Bart. She held them out to the sheriff. $3,400. Paid in full, Josie declared. "The Caldwell debt is settled." The sheriff, a fair-minded man who had never much cared for the Higgins family's ruthless tactics, slowly took the money, thumbing through the crisp bills. He looked at Bart and tipped his hat. "Looks like the lady is right, Bart. Debt's settled. You boys are trespassing." Bart's face turned a mottled, furious purple. He looked at the money, then up at Josie, his fists clenching at his sides. He opened his mouth to spit a venomous insult, but the words died in his throat. Staring up into Josie's fierce, unyielding eyes, he finally realized the truth. He couldn't break her. He never could. Without a word, Bart spun on his heel, mounted his horse, and spurred the animal fiercely, galloping away in a cloud of defeated dust, his father and the deputies trailing awkwardly behind him. The silence that fell over the ranch was profound and peaceful. Clem let out a long, low whistle and headed for the bunkhouse, muttering about needing a week of sleep. Josie stood in the yard, watching the dust settle. She felt a warm presence step up behind her. Samuel didn't say a word at first. He just stood beside her, looking out over the land that was now unequivocally theirs. He turned to face her, stepping close. He didn't have to look down, and she didn't have to look up. They stood perfectly eye to eye. "You cast a mighty long shadow, Josephine Rutledge," Samuel whispered, a reverent smile touching his lips. "Is that going to be a problem for you, Mr. Caldwell?" she asked, a spark of playful defiance in her eyes. Samuel reached out, weaving his calloused fingers through hers, pulling her close. "Not at all, Josie. Out here in the blazing sun, a man needs a good shadow to survive." He kissed her then, not as a conquest, and not out of pity, but as an equal. And for the first time in her life, Josephine didn't feel too big for the world. She felt exactly the right size to hold it. In the end, Josephine Rutledge didn't just find a man who accepted her. She found a partner who matched her spirit. Her height, once deemed a tragic flaw, became the very pillar of their shared survival. Out in the vast, untamed Wyoming territory, true love didn't require a woman to shrink. It only asked her to stand tall, look the storm in the eye, and hold fast.